The letter arrived on a Tuesday, tucked between a notice from the gas company, a catalogue for garden seeds that no one had ordered. Nora Ashfield nearly missed it entirely. She was in the habit of sorting the post quickly, efficiently, the way she did most things in her life, standing at the kitchen counter of her aunt's house in Halifax. Gloves tucked under one arm, gloves tucked under. The envelope was cream-coloured, heavier than ordinary paper, the kind that announced itself. Her name was written on the front in ink so dark it looked almost black. Miss Nora Ashfield. Not a label, not a printout. Someone had written it by hand. The return address was a firm of solicitors in Toronto, Calloway and Merritt barristers. She set it on the counter and made herself a cup of tea before she opened it. She had learned, early and at some cost, not to react to things until she understood what they were. The letter was brief. An estate called Thornfield Ridge, in the rolling farmland west of Kingston, Ontario, required the services of a specialist archivist to catalogue and assess the contents of its private library and historical records. The estate had been in the family of one Lord Calder. The letter used the term with a certain studied neutrality, as if aware it was unusual. For 160 years. The family had recently discovered the collection was larger and more disorganized than previously known. The work was estimated to take several months. The compensation was more than Nora made in a year. She read the letter twice. Then she set it down, drank her tea, and looked out the window at the grey Halifax November. Her credentials were not in question. She had a graduate degree in archival studies from Dalhousie and 6 years of experience cataloguing private collections, mostly for museums and 2 university libraries. She was good at her work. She was thorough, patient, and possessed of an unusual ability to find the organizing logic in chaos, to see the shape of a collection before she had fully examined it, the way a sculptor is said to see the figure hidden inside the stone. What she did not have was money, or a permanent position, or any clear sense of where her life was headed. Her last contract had ended in September. She had been living with her aunt since then, helping with the house, sending applications into the silence. She accepted the position by email that evening, before she could talk herself out of it. Thornfield Ridge was not what she had imagined. She had expected something worn and modest, a farmhouse expanded over generations, the kind of rural Ontario property that carried its age with a certain apologetic slump. What she found, driving up the long gravel lane on a grey December morning, was a stone house of genuine proportion, its facade classical and uncompromising, its wings spreading wide on either side of a central entrance. The maples that lined the drive were bare now, their branches reaching against a low white sky. The whole picture had the quality of an old photograph, precise and still. A woman named Mrs. Tully met her at the door. She was perhaps 60, with the manner of someone who had run a large household for a long time and found most people slightly below the standard she required. She looked at Nora's single bag with an expression that suggested Nora had passed one test and was about to face another. "Lord Calder will see you this afternoon," she said, taking Nora's coat. "He asks that you settle in first. I'll show you the library." The library was in the east wing, behind a set of double doors that stuck slightly when Mrs. Tully pushed them open. The room that was revealed was long and cold and magnificent in its disorder. Floor-to-ceiling shelves ran the length of 3 walls, packed not just with books, but with rolled maps, boxes of loose paper, leather-bound ledgers, and in one corner a collection of what appeared to be surveying equipment that predated Confederation. A large table occupied the center of the room, its surface invisible beneath stacked documents. The smell was familiar to Nora, old paper and dust, and the particular dry cold of a room that was rarely heated, She stood in the doorway and felt the specific pleasure she always felt at such moments, the pleasure of scale, of a problem large enough to matter. "No one has worked in here systematically," Mrs. Tully said from behind her. It was not a question. "No," Nora agreed. "I can see that his lordship would like to know what the estate possesses, what is historically significant, what has practical value, and what can be disposed of." Mrs. Tully paused. "That is all." The phrase had the quality of a quotation, someone else's words passed on exactly. She met Lord Calder at 4 o'clock in a sitting room that smelled of wood smoke and was furnished with the particular mixture of quality and neglect that characterized old money in gradual retreat. He was younger than she had expected, and perhaps 35, with dark hair and a way of holding himself that suggested he was accustomed to filling rooms without necessarily wanting to. He was reading when she entered and finished his sentence before he looked up. "Miss Ashfield," he set the book aside. "Did Mrs. Tully give you the full picture?" "She gave me the library," Nora said. "I'll develop my own picture." Something shifted in his expression, brief and unreadable. He gestured to the chair across from him. "The collection has been accumulating since my great-great-grandfather built the house," he said. "We know it contains personal correspondence, estate records going back to the 1860s, some early maps of the land grants in this region. Whether there is anything of scholarly value, I genuinely don't know. I've never had occasion to look." "What do you need it for?" Nora asked. "The catalogue, estate planning," he said after a pause that was slightly too long, "and an application to a heritage designation program. The provincial government wants an inventory." She noted the pause. She filed it away. "I'll begin in the morning," she said. He nodded, already reaching for his book. She was dismissed. She understood, already part of the furniture. She did not mind. She had always worked best when no one was watching. The first weeks had their own rhythm, the comfortable monotony of methodical work. Nora arrived in the library at 8. Each morning, worked until the light failed in the tall windows, and spent her evenings making notes in the small sitting room attached to her bedroom. The house was largely quiet. Lord Calder was often absent, in Toronto or Ottawa, and when he was present, he kept to his study or walked the estate's outer boundary in the early mornings, a solitary figure against the white fields. She catalogued the books first, the easiest layer. Then the maps, which were extraordinary in places, early surveys of the Ottawa Valley and the Lake Ontario shoreline, several of which she suspected were unknown to the provincial archives. She photographed each one carefully and added detailed notes. Then she reached the ledgers. They were stored in a flat wooden cabinet in the far corner, 22 of them, running from 1863 to 1931. They recorded the financial life of the estate in meticulous columns: rents paid by tenant farmers on the surrounding land, crop yields, household expenses, transactions with suppliers in Kingston and Toronto. Nora was not an accountant. She did not come to the ledgers looking for anything beyond their dates and provenance. But she was trained to notice patterns. It was the core of archival work, the discipline of seeing what was actually there rather than what you expected to find. The pattern she noticed first was small. In the ledgers from the 1890s, there was a standard column for tenant payments, and then, in the margins of certain pages, notations in a different hand from the main clerk's. Smaller, more angular. The main column recorded one figure, the marginal notation appearing beside perhaps a third of the tenant entries, recorded a different figure, always higher, followed by a two-letter abbreviation she did not immediately recognize. RC then, across the bottom of one page, a single additional line in the same small hand. Surplus to RC private account, RC the second Lord Calder, Rupert Calder, who had held the estate from 1887 to 1924. She set the ledger down. She was an archivist. Her job was to catalogue, to note, to organise. Lord Calder had been precise on this point. That is all. She picked up the ledger again. The difference between the recorded rent and the margin figure was not large for any individual tenant. A few dollars here, a portion of a harvest there. In 1897, a tenant named Beckett paid $60 a year according to the official column. The margin said 82. In 1901, a tenant identified only as Holloway Farm recorded 45. The margin said 60. Taken alone, it meant nothing. Rents fluctuated. There were different rates for different parcels. There were arrangements she didn't know the history of, but she had 22 ledgers, and the pattern ran through all of them that covered Rupert Calder's tenure. She began to cross-reference. The estate held boxes of correspondence, which she had catalogued but not read closely. She went back to them now, in the evenings, her lamp making a small warm circle in the cold room. She found letters from tenant farmers to the estate office, formal and careful, written in the laboured hand of men who had learned to write as adults. Complaints, mostly, and then acceptances, and then silence. She found the estate office's responses, curt and legal, making reference to adjusted assessments and special levies for use of particular access roads or water sources. She found the water source ledger, a separate book, slim and water-stained, recording fees charged for access to the creek that ran through the estate and across the tenant farms. It was dated 1891. It had no counterpart before that year, and no counterpart after 1924, the year Rupert Calder died. She found his personal account book tucked in a box labelled Miscellaneous Correspondence, where it had clearly been misfiled by someone in a hurry. His expenses were those of a man living considerably beyond what the estate's official income would have supported. A house on Jarvis Street in Toronto, a lengthy trip to England in 1903, investments in mining ventures in northern Ontario. Regular deposits to an account at a bank that no longer existed, recorded only as quarterly transfer, Thornfield surplus. She assembled it slowly, across 2 weeks of evenings, the way she assembled all her work, without drama, without reaching conclusions before the evidence justified them. When she was certain, she sat in the cold library with the lamp burning low and allowed herself to understand what she had found. Rupert Calder had been charging his tenant farmers, many of them immigrants who had broken the land and built their farms from open fields, a concealed premium on top of their documented rent, for 2 decades, through invented fees and adjusted assessments that were never reflected in the official books. The amounts, small by small, were enormous in sum, and the money was not in the estate. It had been spent, invested, largely lost. It had not built a barn, or mended a road, or seeded a failing field. It had funded a comfortable life for one man, and left its wound quietly behind. The families whose names appeared in those ledgers: Beckett, Holloway, Sinclair, Picard. Their descendants were, she knew from the estate's current records, still farming the same land, still paying rent to Thornfield Ridge. Still, in some cases, struggling. She stared at the lamp for a long time. Her father had been a schoolteacher. He had taught her that a fact concealed was a kind of lie, and that the purpose of keeping records was not to serve the powerful, but to serve the truth. The past was not the property of those who had made it, he had said once in his careful way. It belongs to everyone who has to live with it. She took a clean legal pad from her bag and began to write. She asked for a meeting through Mrs. Tully, as she had been instructed to for all but the most routine matters. The housekeeper looked at her with eyes that had seen a great deal and judged most of it accurately. "He has time on Thursday," Mrs. Tully said. "His meeting in Toronto was moved." "Thursday is fine," Nora said. "Thank you." She spent the intervening days compiling her summary with the same care she would give any professional report. She organized it chronologically, cross-referenced every claim to a specific document, and included a separate list of sources with their locations in the collection. It was clear and complete, and she was not ashamed of a single sentence in it. Lord Calder received her in the study, a room she had not entered before. It was ordered in the way that working rooms become ordered when one person occupies them for years, its surfaces clear except for deliberate piles, its shelves arranged by some logic that was his own. He stood when she entered, which she noted, and gestured to the chair across from his desk. Mrs. Tully said this concerned the archives, he said. He was in a dark suit, and he looked tired, in a way that had become familiar to her, not the tiredness of a bad night, but the sustained tiredness of ongoing pressure. She had learned, without seeking to, that the estate's finances were not comfortable. There had been a conversation with Mrs. Tully, overheard without intention, about whether the East Wing could be heated this winter. "It does concern the archives," she said. She placed the summary on his desk. "I found something in the ledgers that I believe you need to see." He looked at the papers. He did not pick them up. "What sort of something?" "Evidence," she said, "of a systematic discrepancy between the rents recorded officially in the Thornfield Ridge ledgers and the amounts actually paid by tenant farmers during your great-great-grandfather's tenure. The difference was redirected to a private account. It ran for approximately 30 years. The room was very quiet. Outside, wind moved through the bare maple branches with a sound like dry paper. Lord Calder leaned back in his chair. His face had not changed expression, but she sensed something closing behind his eyes, a shutter drawn across a window. "You were hired to catalogue the collection," he said. His voice was even. "Not to audit my family's financial history. My obligation is to the accuracy of the record," Nora said. "What I found in this collection is part of that record." "What you found," he said, "is a series of old notations that you have interpreted, without any training in historical accounting, as evidence of wrongdoing on the part of a man who has been dead for 90 years. She kept her voice as measured as his. "The summary includes the source for every claim. I'd ask that you read it." He did not look at the papers. His gaze was on her face, and it was not warm. "I am in the middle of a heritage designation application," he said, "a process that requires the cooperation of provincial authorities, the involvement of local historical societies, and a considerable amount of public goodwill. You are asking me to accept, on the basis of an archivist's private reading of Ledger Marginalia, that this estate was built on fraud." He paused. "Do you understand the implications of what you're suggesting?" "Yes," she said. "I'm not certain you do." He stood, a move that was clearly habitual when he wanted to end a discussion. "The families who farm this land have leases with this estate, leases that function, that are fair, that have been honored for generations. Whatever you think you've found in those ledgers, it does not change the present. It does not help anyone. The truth of the past changes the present," she said, "whether we acknowledge it or not." He looked at her then with an expression she recognized, the expression of a person who has decided, without examination, that the source of a problem is the person who named it. "I think," he said, "that you have allowed yourself to become invested in a narrative that isn't yours to tell. You are an archivist. Your job is to list and to label. That is what you were hired for, and that is the limit of your mandate." He moved to the window. He did not look at her. "I would appreciate it if you returned to the catalogue and left the interpretation to people who understand the context." The injustice of it settled on her like cold water. She had spent weeks on this. She had been careful, thorough, exact. She had not invented anything or reached beyond what the evidence bore, and he was standing at the window, his back to her, speaking to the glass. "I understand your position," she said. "I would ask you to understand mine. I found evidence of harm. I cannot unknow it, and I cannot in good conscience continue to organize a collection without noting that one part of it documents a wrong that was done to people whose families are still part of this community." She stood, gathering herself. "I'll leave the summary on your desk. What you do with it is your decision." He turned then. His voice, when it came, was quiet and cut clean. "I think you may have misunderstood the scope of this position, Miss Ashfield. I have any number of qualified archivists who would approach this work with the appropriate detachment." He paused. "Any number." The words were precise and deliberate, and they landed exactly as they were meant to. She looked at him for a moment, and what she felt was not anger, exactly, but a clarifying sorrow, the particular sadness of seeing a person choose the easier thing. "Then perhaps you should contact them," she said. Her voice was quiet. "I wish you well with the designation." She left the summary on the corner of his desk. She did not slam the door. She did not take the stairs fast. She walked back to her room and began, with the same methodical calm she brought to everything, to pack. Rowan Calder stood at the window for a long time after she left. The house was quiet. The wind had died. In the distance, the fields lay white and flat under a January sky. He had not touched the summary. He had watched her leave, her footsteps steady on the corridor floor, and he had felt a complicated surge of righteous certainty. He was the one responsible for this estate, for the people on it, for the designation application that would, if successful, bring heritage funding and tax relief and some stability to a situation that had been sliding sideways for 3 years. He could not afford a disruption. Not now. Not from an archivist who had been on the property for 6 weeks and thought she understood what was at stake. He went to his desk. The summary sat at the corner, its pages square and precise, the way she did everything. He sat down and looked at it. He would read it, he told himself, the way he read everything he didn't trust carefully, looking for the flaw. He would find the leap, the misreading, the place where her analysis exceeded her evidence. He would confirm what he already believed, which was that she had constructed a story from partial information, and then he would feel fully justified in his response. He opened to the first page. The organization was immediately, frustratingly clear. Each tenant identified by name and ledger page, each discrepancy noted by year, with the official figure in one column and the margin figure in another. Source citations at the bottom of every section. She had not written a word that she had not also sourced. He read for an hour. Then he got up and went to the filing cabinet where the estate records were kept. The records he had never had reason to examine closely, that his solicitor and his estate manager handled. He pulled out ledger 14, the one she had cited first. He found the page. The columns were as she described. The margin notation was as she described. His great-great-grandfather's handwriting, he recognized it from signed letters he had seen framed in the study, small and angular and certain of itself. He pulled out the water source ledger. He found the personal account book she had referenced and sat with it under the desk lamp for a long time. When he finally set it down, the room was dark. He had not turned on more lights. He sat in the dim study with the papers spread around him and understood what she had found. It was not ambiguous. It was not a misreading. It was meticulous, sustained, and it had been recorded in the family's own hand, in the family's own books, and then buried under enough organizational neglect that no one had looked at it in 90 years. He thought about the Beckett family, whose grandson still farmed the North Parcel. He thought about the heritage designation application, about what it meant to ask the province to formally recognize Thornfield Ridge as a place of historical significance when its history contained this. He thought about what he had said to her. Any number. The shame arrived slowly, the way cold arrived in the east wing when the heating failed. Sought seeping through the walls until it was simply the condition of the room. He had stood in his own study and accused her of overreach, of narrative investment, of lacking the appropriate detachment. He had said those things to a woman who had spent 6 weeks doing careful, honest, excellent work, and who had come to him not to cause trouble, but because she believed, correctly, that he needed to know she had done the hard thing. She had brought the truth to the person who had the power to act on it, and he had told her she had any number of replacements. He looked at the clock. It was nearly 9 in the evening. He did not know what time the first bus left Kingston for Halifax in the morning, but he suspected she would find out. Mrs. Tully would have given her the schedule if she'd asked. Mrs. Tully had a way of knowing what was needed before it was requested. He put on his coat and went downstairs. The house was quiet in the particular way of a winter evening, every sound contained within its own small radius. Mrs. Tully was in the kitchen, sitting at the table with a cup of tea, and she looked up when he appeared in the doorway. "Miss Ashfield," he said, "has she eaten?" "I brought something to her room," Mrs. Tully said, with the careful neutrality she deployed when she had opinions, when she had not been asked to share. She thanked me very politely. He looked at the woman who had kept this house running through 3 different versions of Calder financial difficulty, and knew she was waiting for him to do the right thing or do the wrong thing, and would not tell him which was which. "I need to speak with her," he said. "Her light is still on," Mrs. Tully said, and returned to her tea. He knocked on the door of the east guest room at 9:15. He heard her cross the floor, and then a pause, and then the door opened. She was still dressed, her coat folded over the back of the chair, her single bag packed and standing beside the wardrobe. She looked at him without saying anything. "I read the summary," he said. "I assumed you would eventually. I also pulled the ledgers, the ones you referenced." She waited. "You were right," he said. There was no preamble to it, and no softening. He owed her the bluntness at least. "All of it. It's exactly what you said it was." The hallway lamp behind him cast his shadow into the room, long and uncertain. He felt, standing in that doorway, the specific discomfort of being exactly as wrong as someone had told him he was. "I don't expect you to stay," he said. "You have every reason to go. What I said to you this afternoon was unfair, and it was unkind, and I am sorry for it." He stopped. He was not given to long speeches, but I am asking you to stay, not because I need an archivist, though I do, because I don't know how to do this without someone who isn't going to let me take the easier road. He looked at her. "I think you know better than anyone in this house what the right thing is, and I think I'm going to need that." Nora looked at the man in the doorway of her room. He was not at this moment the contained and certain person who had the window of his study that afternoon, who had stood at the window of his study that afternoon. He was someone who had spent an evening, inherited, was sitting on a fracture, and who had come to a door because he had run out of arguments against her. She thought about the Beckett name in the ledgers. She thought about the families on the land. She thought about what it meant to find a wound and then walk away from it because it wasn't technically her responsibility. She looked at her packed bag. She looked back at him. "I'll stay through spring," she said. "But I need to know you understand what this will require. It won't be comfortable, and it won't be fast, and I won't let you soften it." "I know," he said. "Then we start tomorrow," she said, "with the Beckett lease." She did not move from the doorway. He nodded once, and then he went back down the hall, and she heard his footsteps on the stairs, steady and deliberate, going down toward the library. She unpacked her bag. She did not do it quickly, or with relief, or with any particular feeling she could name. She did it, the way she did most things, carefully and completely. And then she made herself a cup of tea with the electric kettle on the dresser, and sat in the chair by the window and looked out at the frozen fields of Thornfield Ridge. The weeks that followed were unlike anything the estate had known in a long time. If it had ever known anything quite like this at all, Rowan, he had asked her, on the third day, with a certain awkward formality, whether she would call him by his name, since they were going to be working in close enough proximity that his title began to feel like a formality neither of them could afford. Rowan spent the first week simply reading. He read everything she had compiled. He sat in the library with the ledgers and the correspondence and the water source book, and he did not speak much and ate the meals Mrs. Tully brought without seeming to notice them. When he emerged from that week, something had shifted in the quality of his attention. He was still quiet, still contained, but the containment had a different character. It was no longer the sealed-off quality of someone who needed not to know something. It was the stillness of someone who knew something they could not undo. "We need to talk to the families," he said, one morning at the kitchen table, which had become, without discussion, their working table. The formal dining room was too large for the kind of work they were doing. "Yes," Nora said, "I don't know how to begin that conversation." "You begin it by telling the truth," she said. "Exactly what happened, in plain language. No softening, no legal hedging. You say, 'My great-great-grandfather charged your family more than the records show, kept the difference, and I have the proof.' And then you say what you intend to do about it. And what do I intend to do about it?" She looked at him. "That's what you need to decide before you make any visits." He sat with that for a day. Then he called his solicitor in Toronto and had a long conversation that Nora did not hear and did not ask about. That evening he came to the kitchen with a legal pad covered in figures and sat down across from her. "The estate has assets," he said, "not liquid, but real. The Jarvis Street property in Toronto is gone, sold by my grandfather. But there are parcels at the edge of the estate that aren't farmed and aren't productive, and there's a collection of historical mining shares my great-grandfather held that may have some value to a collector." Nora looked at the figures. "It's not enough to fully compensate 30 years of overpayment," he said. "I know that, but it's a beginning, and I can restructure the current leases. The existing tenants can receive new agreements, below market rates, for as long as they want them." "It won't fix everything," Nora said. "No," he agreed. "It won't." They went to the farms together. Rowan drove. Nora sat with the documentation in case it was needed, in case anyone wanted to see the evidence rather than take his word for it. The visits were not easy. The Breckett farm was first. The tenant was a man in his late 50s named Gordon, whose grandfather had been one of the primary names in the ledger. He stood in the doorway of his farmhouse in the January cold and listened to Rowan's account without expression. When it was done, he was silent for a long moment. "My grandfather used to say he could never get ahead," he said finally. "He always said it was the land. That this land just didn't want to give." He looked at Rowan. He worked himself to pieces on it. "Rhino," he said. "I'm sorry. I know that's not sufficient." The Breckett man looked at Nora, and she understood that her presence was serving exactly the function Rowan had described. She was evidence of his sincerity. A witness who had no stake in his comfort. Some of the visits went better than that one. Some went worse. One family asked them to leave, and did not want to continue the conversation at all, and Rowan accepted that without argument, left a letter with contact information, and drove back to the estate in silence. Nora did not try to fill it. By March, new leases had been signed with 6 of the 11 tenant families. A trust had been established with the proceeds from the sold parcels, its purpose the maintenance of land that the original tenants had farmed, and their descendants could continue to farm. It was not restitution, not fully. It was the shape restitution takes when you come to it 90 years late. But the families who signed the new leases knew the history now. They knew their own grandfathers had been right. There was a particular dignity in that. The heritage designation application was withdrawn. Rowan sent the letter himself. He did not explain to Nora why, precisely. He did not need to. She understood that you could not ask the province to celebrate a history you had just spent 3 months honestly reckoning with. Not yet. Perhaps not for a long time. What surprised her was what he said, one evening in late March, when the light was finally beginning to stay longer, and the first uncertain green was appearing at the edges of the fields. The application was for the wrong reason anyway, he said. They were in the library, the long table finally clear. The collection fully catalogued and organized and properly housed. It had taken the whole winter. I wanted the designation for the funding. I wanted the funding because I was afraid. The estate is struggling, and I was looking for a way to stabilize it that didn't require me to look too closely at why it was struggling in the first place. Nora waited. My great-great-grandfather extracted what he needed and called it management, Rowan said. I was doing something related on a smaller scale, using the estate's history as an asset without wanting to know what that history contained. She looked at him across the table. She had come to know him in the specific way you know someone when you have watched them be wrong and then watched them decide to be better. It was a different kind of knowledge than admiration. It was quieter and more durable. The land is actually productive if you manage it honestly, she said. The north parcel could support a tenant willing to grow market crops. The east boundary has a drainage issue that's been neglected since at least the 1950s, based on the records. If you fix it, the yield on that section could triple. He looked at her. You've been reading the agricultural records. I catalogued everything, she said simply. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, What are you doing after spring? She had not expected the question. She looked down at the table, at the neat rows of indexed folders, the careful system they had built together over the winter months. I don't know, she said honestly. I hadn't thought that far. I would ask you to stay, he said. Not as an archivist. We don't have enough left to catalogue. The corner of his mouth moved very slightly, in what was not quite a smile. As someone who knows this place, who knows its history and what it owes, the estate needs that. I need that. She looked up at him. He was not the man who had stood at the study window in December, certain and sealed and looking out at the dark. He was a man who had spent a winter reading the truth about a place he had inherited, and then doing the slower and harder work of acting on what he'd read. He was not finished. She doubted he would be finished for a long time. The work of this kind was not the kind that ended. But it was the kind she knew how to do. I'll stay through harvest, she said. He nodded. Something in his expression settled, careful and warm. We should look at the drainage issue, he said. Tomorrow, she said. It'll still be there tomorrow. Outside, the last of the winter light was leaving the fields, and the sky above Thornfield Ridge had turned the particular clear blue of a March evening in Ontario, the colour of a season almost over and another one about to begin. The collection was catalogued. The record was honest. The past was what it was, a scar the land carried in its soil, and the families carried in their memory. But the new leases were signed, and the trust was funded, and in 6 of the 11 farmhouses on the estate's boundary, someone knew the truth of their own grandfather's life for the first time. Nora Ashfield sat in the library she had organized across a winter in a house she had come to know in the way you know places where you have done necessary and difficult work, and she thought that this was what the record was for. not to preserve the comfortable version of the past, to hold the real one so that the people who came after had something true to build from. She took out her legal pad and began a new page. Thornfield Ridge Estate Collection, Supplementary Notes, March 1987. The following documents the corrective measures undertaken following the discovery of systematic financial discrepancies in the Rupert Calder estate management records, 1891 to 1924. It is the intention of the current estate holder that this record remain accessible to all tenant families and their descendants in perpetuity. She wrote until the lamp was the only light in the room, and outside, the blue evening had deepened to dark, and somewhere across the north field, a light came on in the Breckett farmhouse window, small and steady in the cold.